Okay, so on and back into chapter 14, talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So AD, aggregate demand, AS, aggregate supply.
You're not going to review what you did?
We're going to review really quick. What are the axes that we put on our graph when we are dealing with the macro level economy?
CPI.
CPI.
Real GDP.
Real GDP. Now, these seem like different things compared to the micro world where we put up here prices and quantity. But remember, what does CPI measure?
Prices.
Prices, right? So this is just prices at the macro level. Real GDP, what is real GDP? It's the sum of all goods and services produced, or the quantity of goods and service produced by your economy in a given time frame. Hence, it looks like it's not prices and quantity, it just is in a macro view instead of a micro view. Okay? So what I like to tell students is that, yeah, we change these things a little bit, but really it's the same thing.
Price and quantity.
Yeah, it's price and quantity. You just have to write price and quantity according to whatever scope you are looking at. Right? This is a really wide scope. Right? We could take out an entire country with this scope. Wouldn't be a bad idea. Alright, so what does aggregate demand look like?
Demand line.
It looks like every other demand line you have ever written, right? That's the nice part about aggregate demand. It's just basically demand with an A in front of it. So just make sure you put the A. Alright? Again, why is it downward sloping? What are our three effects?
CPI rises, real GDP.
Right, real balances effect, or consumers spend less, not spend less, but buy less when prices rise. Again, assuming that our incomes are relatively fixed. Then export effect. When our prices are going up, what do?
Buy more.
We buy more from them, right? And what do other countries do when they see our prices going up?
So stop buying.
They say, screw you, US, right? So higher US prices equals less US exports and more US imports. And again, that's a double whammy, folks. That's going to make GDP go down twice. Once for the exports and once for the imports, right? And then the last one is the interest rate effect. And when interest rates are directly tied to inflation rates, when inflation goes up, so do interest rates. So when interest rates go up, what do our businesses do? Yeah. Businesses, if I could spell business. Businesses borrow less, and business investment falls. So all four non-government pieces of GDP are going to fall when prices rise, right? This is C, this is X minus M, and this is I. The only other piece that's not in there for our GDP formula? G.
G, the government.
Yeah, the government. The government's the only thing that doesn't care about prices, right? And again, the example I gave you was that the government, when toilet seats cost $2,000, they buy 10 of them instead of 5. Why? Because they needed them. And they could store them. They probably didn't really need them. There's plenty of toilet seats in the government. Alright, so, anyways, for aggregate demand, it's a downward sloping line. Now, the fun part was the aggregate supply side, right? There were two philosophies that we were discussing last time when it came to dealing with aggregate supply. One was the Keynesian philosophy, and the Keynesian philosophy said That aggregate supply is really this flat curve. That when you are in a deep recession or a depression, when GDP is low or falling, prices don't change much. And the reason why, we said, of course, is that there's this whole new realm of the world since the 1930s where businesses can store goods. We can keep track of goods a little bit better so that we don't have to have huge inventories or remove inventories the way we used to, right? Basically, it was the lack of flexible prices and wages. So on the prices side, businesses wouldn't lower their price just because there was a really big surplus. They may lower them a little, but not a lot. And in addition, wages didn't fall when businesses earned less money because wages, they were now protected by unions, and the unions said, hey, you can't lower our wages just because you're making less money. That's unfair, right? If the company's making less money, you guys just have to make less money, deal with it, right? That's the union's job, right? So, these are the Keynesians. And the classicalists, or the standard economists back in the 1930s, they had a different view. Remember that the classical economists assumed that we were always very near full employment, right? That pretty much everybody is working, and because, well, their reasoning was because if someone doesn't have a job in the classical world in the 1800s, yeah, they were removed from the equation entirely, right? I mean, if you didn't have a job back in the 1800s, you died. In the 1930s, we got a little bit more quote-unquote humane, and when people lost their jobs, we started giving them unemployment so that they could find a new job instead of dying, which was considered bad. And businesses agreed with this, right? Actually, businesses liked the concept of unemployment because if the workforce shrinks, what happens to businesses? Yeah, they should. They don't have enough workers. And if there aren't enough workers, what do businesses have to do in order to get workers? Yeah, I mean, they're going to have to pay them more, right? When there's less workers, what happens, right? When there's a shortage of workers, all of a sudden workers are now worth a lot more. They get paid a lot more. That means that costs rise for a business. So businesses, the reason they agreed to unemployment, folks, is because they were tired of people dying and wages going up because there weren't enough people to do the jobs. I mean, businesses actually used to like unemployment because it kept the people alive long enough so that they could leave one job and move to the next one.
Keep paying them too little money and...
Well, as long as they survived, they were happy, right? I mean, you know, because you get that 8-year-old kid who's working, you know, 12 to 16-hour shifts on the line. Welcome to the 1930s, folks. All right, so what we were trying to figure out, well, so, you know, again, according to classical economists, their number one tenet, the one thing that they believe that's true about the economy, the reason why we can make this assumption is because wages and prices really are flexible. When there is a recession, again, here's aggregate demand, folks. Alright? So, everyone, including classical economists, agree that when there is a recession, aggregate demand falls. So aggregate demand shifts to the left. And classical economists will say there will be a dip in GDP. It will dip to here. To say from 4 billion down to 3.5 billion GDP. But what classical economists say is this is how much is being produced. This is just how much is being purchased, right? That means that there's a surplus, right? This much is a surplus. There's a $500 million worth of surplus goods. So what do businesses have to do to get rid of those goods?
Lower their prices.
Lower prices. And when the businesses lower their prices, what happened to consumers?
They buy more.
They start buying more, right? So prices start to fall, and GDP starts to rise, right? As long as there's still a surplus, what do those businesses have to keep doing? Lowering the price. And the whole point is that the price is that when they get to that spot where supply and demand hit each other again, GDP will be back to 4 billion. And all that'll happen is that prices have adjusted to that lack of demand for a while, and they just lower prices. Everybody's making less, everybody's paying less. Nice thing, nothing changed, right? Which is sort of nice, right? I mean, it would be great if that's the way the economy worked today. Why doesn't it?
Because the surplus doesn't affect them as much.
That's right. Used to be that surpluses affected businesses more, right? Businesses needed all of their sales to guarantee that they had enough profit money to pay their wages and to pay their CEOs and to pay their managers and all the other stuff. What they discovered was that there was this banking industry that they could borrow from whenever they were short cash a little bit, and they could just ride out any depression or recession by borrowing money instead of making money. And as long as interest rates were low, it's no big deal. And then when demand recovered and they could start making the profits that they were making before, they could start paying off those loans slowly but surely. And that's kind of how business worked through the 30s and the 40s to some degree. Now, my question to you guys was, how do we mitigate these two pieces of the aggregate supply curve? How do we put them together? Well, your initial guess or suspicion may be, we'll just put them together, right? Put them both there. Now, don't put this in your notes, just bear with me, right? I'm going to lead you to the answer, all right? So don't put this down yet. So you may say, well, here is really the way aggregate supply works. It really makes this right-hand turn. So until you get to somewhere near full employment, your aggregate supply curve acts like what Keynes said, right? And again, remember, it's spelled Keynes. Please call him Keynes. He's a Brit. You get upset if you call him Keynes. Okay? So this is what people assumed for a little while, that there was going to be this abrupt shift in the economy, right? That it would just all of a sudden, once we got to full employment, everything would sort of go back to the way it used to be, right? So what a lot of economists said was, Keynes, as soon as this recession thing is over, or we get done with this, we recover, right? This happens, all of your theories are going to be bunk, right? Because once the economy's back at full employment, here we are. It's going to start doing what we thought it was doing before. And Keynes is like, well, in theory, yes. In reality, what? It's like, do you really think it's going to go back to the way it was? All right? Well, Keynes then said, okay, guys, I agree with you that if we are at full employment, this is the way aggregate supply looks. If everybody has a job, everybody will be okay, right? They will have enough money to at least survive. They will continue to survive. If they lose their jobs, they'll be able to find another one, because that's what full employment means, right? If you lose your job for a little while, you get another one coming back. Again, this is the made-up world of economists. Bear with me. So what happened was that most of the 1940s and 1950s economists said, look, guys, there's an in-between stage. And that's how they mitigated the two different stages of aggregate supply. When you are in a recession, this is the way aggregate supply will look. You will look like you are in what's called the Keynesian portion of the aggregate supply. So aggregate supply has three stages. One of them is called the Keynesian range, and this is when the economy is in a depression. Perhaps there's an E in there. depression / recession. And when aggregate supply is flat, demand will drive higher GDP, but not higher prices. Okay? And if you think about this, I mean, the cool thing about it is that we can even see this happening here in 2008, 2009. Right? We had the quote-unquote Great Recession where GDP fell for 5 straight quarters. The 6th quarter, late 2009, when we saw our first growth in GDP again, did we see a huge spike in prices? No. We did see a growth in prices, a very, very, very little bit, but we did not see a huge jump in inflation, right? And as aggregate demand kept growing, in fact, 2009, 2010, 2011, hell, even 2012 and 2013, aggregate demand has been continuing to grow, but what has been happening to prices? They're staying relatively low. We have like 1.5% inflation. That's been the highest inflation rate that we've had in the last 4 years. Some things have gone up more than 1.5%, I agree. But overall, on average, CPI growth is 1.5%. What economists are waiting for, what they're hoping for, the point where you get out of the recession is when you get into this next range of the aggregate supply curve. And they couldn't come up with a better name for it, so they just called it intermediate, because it's in between the two different schools of economic thinking. The Keynesians and the classicalists. This is the intermediate stage. It's the in-between stage. It's where you have gotten out of a recession, but you haven't really made it to full employment yet. You're getting there, but you haven't made it, right? So the second stage is intermediate. And this is when the economy is recovering from a recession, but not close to full employment. We're close, we're getting there, we're starting to see unemployment numbers fall, but no one would say that our unemployment numbers are good enough that we are quote-unquote close to full employment. So there's a debate in some economic worlds or some economic thinking that says we have made it to this stage of aggregate supply, and other people tend not to think it. A little bit of a toss-up at the moment. But then the last range of the aggregate supply curve is this classical range, which is vertical. And the classical range is when you've hit full employment, or you're really close to full employment. At or very near full employment. And I would assume that none of you think that currently the economy is in the classical range of the aggregate supply curve. Alright, so this is how we put together the Keynesian belief of aggregate supply and the classical economic belief of aggregate supply, and we slap them in together with a stage in between where you're moving from or towards one or the other two stages. Now, note, what stage the economy is in drives what stage aggregate demand is hitting the aggregate supply curve, okay? So when I say that the economy is in the tank, we're in a recession, and I ask you to draw aggregate demand and aggregate supply, you will draw aggregate demand in the Keynesian range, because that's what a recession means. If I tell you the economy is recovering from a recession, but not fully recovered yet, you will draw aggregate demand in the intermediate stage. And when we are at or near full employment, you will draw the aggregate demand curve in the aggregate supply, the classical section of the aggregate supply curve. All right? So because there's 3 stages, the basis that the economy is in drives which stage you draw your aggregate demand curve. Now, if we had lots and lots of time to play around with this, or we had a full semester of macroeconomy, we would talk about how far along this line, or this line, or this line you are. For this class, as long as you're in the right range, I'm a happy man. Okay? So, draw AD/AS when the economy is in a recession.
Keynesian.
It's in that Keynesian range. So please don't, when you draw aggregate supply, while we are in the Keynesian range, please don't just draw the Keynesian range. Draw all the 3 ranges all the time. Okay? So give me Keynesian, intermediate, and classical. And then draw aggregate demand down here in the Keynesian range. Okay? What I liked it to this is my mnemonic. It's the kick mnemonic. The aggregate supply curve is a kicking curve. It starts at Keynes.
It says kick ass.
I wouldn't notice that.
It's kick ass.
But that's, again though, realize that these are the 3 stages. Keynesian, intermediate, classical. Alright? Alright, now. Quick review. What moves the aggregate demand curve again?
CPI.
Non-price determinants, right? Yes, non-price determinants, I agree. What are our non-price determinants? What's the equation?
Consumer spending.
C.
Plus
I, investment.
GX,
G, government.
X,
Exports.
M.
Imports. These are the 5 things that move the aggregate demand curve. Those should be really easy for you to remember because it's the frickin' formula for GDP. That's why you memorized it, right? Okay, good man. So, why did I put a green star next to M?
Because it is an inverse relationship.
Why do imports have an inverse relationship?
Because the GDP is not staying here.
When we're having more imports, what's happening in GDP?
Goes down.
Going down, right? So remember the formula. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. That star is there because there's a minus in front of the M. Imports are bad for our economy. We don't want, in theory, us buying goods from other countries. An increase in that will lower GDP or aggregate demand. So note, a lot of people will say that this is also the formula for aggregate demand a lot of times. They kind of go hand in hand. All right, so if we have stuff that moves the aggregate demand curve, what moves the aggregate supply curve?
Price determinants.
Price
determinants, the CPI.
The non-price determinants of supply, but those are not the same as the non-price determinants of demand, all right? So these ones are not quite as obvious, but some of them should be relatively straightforward. So if you think back to your non-price determinants of supply for the micro world, one of them was resource costs. except that in the microeconomic world, it would be the resource costs for one industry. At the macro level, it's the resource costs for every industry, okay? So resource costs here, these are things like electricity prices, gas prices, land prices, right? Although that land one is a little, it used to be a bigger deal. Businesses used to need land. The new economy, a lot of the computer-driven economies, do you need a big, huge building to work? No. You don't even need an office building, right? I mean, there's a lot of businesses out there that are designed so that everybody can just work at home.
You don't even need a lot of employees.
Yeah, exactly, right? A lot of it can be almost automated to some degree, right? So this land one, I tend to put it in quotes nowadays because it used to be a bigger deal.
Labor is not one of the resource costs.
It kind of is. Again, because it's definitely something. If everybody in labor is demanding more wages,
Maybe robots.
by robots to some degree, yes. All right, so
Taxes.
yeah, taxes are on there, folks. There's going to be taxes at every level.
Technological change.
One of the other classic ones that you expect are technology. And again, this is technology that is affecting everyone, right? Remember what scope we have on. This is the scope of the entire world. So what sorts of technologies have we invented that have affected the entire world?
Cars.
Well, that was the first one, right? Back in the 30s. Computers. Computers were a huge deal. That's what the 80s were all about, right? That's what Clinton was such a great president for.
Yeah, you can look as far back as, you know, when the steam locomotives came.
Sure,
I mean,
exactly.
That was a technology that never existed before.
Exactly. That's why computers were the same thing. That's why the internet is the next big thing, right? The 2000s, the late 90s, 2000s, the internet was a technology that helped everybody. Now you could sell your, your handcrafted macrame pot holders to anybody in the world instead of just the people at the 4-H fair. Yeah. So these sorts of technologies are what we're talking about. I'm not talking about things like they designed a better grass seed so that we can all grow grass cheaper, or they discovered a better way to make a table, because a table is not a macro level event, right? Building a better table doesn't make everybody work better. I mean, or at least you should think it does. All right. So again, think of these technological changes as entire world changes. All right. Stuff that's affecting pretty much the entire economy that could exist. All right. What else is on there?
Subsidies.
Subsidies. So it used to be back in the micro world that we had subsidies and taxes on the same level. When we get to the macro level, we actually separate them because subsidies are such a big deal. All right. Again, these are global level subsidies. So this is where the government gives the oil industries, $30 billion a year every year to go hunt for more oil, right? Or paying farmers an extra $200 or $300 every year because they don't farm around the waterways, right? And they pay them for doing nothing, a subsidy.
What about, like, giving them money to clean up pollution?
Well,
or charge them for polluting.
They charge them, yes. That's the next one. What's the next one?
That's regulation.
Regulations. That's the last one, right? So regulations are another thing that affects aggregate supply. If you regulate everyone and tell them you can only create so much pollution, and if you create more than that you have to pay, please note all three of those are starred. If any of these go up, what happens to aggregate supply?
Goes down.
Down, right? If resource costs go up, businesses produce less. If businesses are taxed more, they will produce less. If businesses are regulated more, they will produce less. Right? I mean, that's just the nature of the beast, okay? So the aggregate supply curve tends to be a little bit more painful than the aggregate demand curve, but it's also got 3 ranges, so you should kind of expect that this time. All right, so what we need to do now for the rest of the class here is start playing around with aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Just like we did back in chapter 3, where we said, let's start moving supply and demand and tell me what happens to prices and quantity. We're going to do the same thing here, except I'm going to ask you what happens to CPI and real GDP. And what's the other third goal of the macroeconomy?
Get to equilibrium.
Equilibrium. But what are the 3 goals of the macroeconomy again? Stable prices,
Growth.
growth in the economy,
Full employment.
full employment. Which 2 of those go together?
Growth and
Prices.
full employment.
Growth in the economy and full employment. So please tell me, whenever GDP rises, what also rises with it?
Employment.
Employment, or unemployment falls, depending on.
So when you satisfy those 3 things, you reach equilibrium, correct? Or so they want to say.
Yeah, I mean, but the problem, of course, is that sometimes when you're moving to equilibrium, you're moving to a worse equilibrium where prices may be higher, right? Would that be good for the economy?
When you say the economy, you mean the consumers, or
The economy means how we measure the economy. What are the 3 things that we care about at the economic level? We don't care about consumers at the economic level. We really don't. We care about the 3 things. Prices, GDP, and employment. That's it. So when you talk economy, if you start talking about consumers, when you talk about the economy, you're comparing apples and oranges. They're not the same thing. A consumer is part of the economy, but the economy is a measurement of the sum of all consumers. And this is one of those things that piss me off about people who complain about GDP going down or inflation going up, saying, well, all the prices of things I buy are going up. And I'm like, then quit buying those things. Buy the stuff that isn't going up in price, because right now inflation is very low. You're just buying the wrong stuff. You're getting unlucky, to some degree. Right?
Lower your standards.
Potentially. So, do not try and tell me that consumers and the economy are the same thing. They make up a part of it, but not a big part of it, but not the whole thing. Close, but not quite. All right, so let's start. Let's go back to 2008. Assume we are in a recession. So when I ask you these questions from chapter 14, I will set the table for you. I will tell you what state the economy is in. This tells you where equilibrium is now. Okay? So where would equilibrium be right now? The Keynesian. Keynes. So again, when you think of Keynes, think of the Miami Hurricanes, because it's Keynes. Right? Just think of them as a really good football, basketball team, right? So when you set up this problem, you're going to draw your aggregate supply curve. Always draw your aggregate supply curve first. And again, in your head, think what the 3 ranges are. Kick. It's kick ass, right? So it's K-I-C, Keynes, intermediate classical. And we are in the Keynesian range because we're in a recession. Therefore, aggregate demand is somewhere over here. Okay, that starts it. Now, let's have an economic event. Back in 2009, what did President Obama do after this big, huge recession started?
bailouts.
Bailouts and lots of spending of money, right? Government spending went up. $1.3 trillion. Government increases spending by $1.3 trillion. And I want you to tell me what's going to happen to the economy because of that. And again,
as far as the real GDP,
all 3 things. What does the macroeconomy care about?
3 things:
GDP,
GDP,
employment,
price,
and prices. So anytime an economic event goes, the 3 things you got to give me are what those 3 things. What happened to GDP, what happened to employment, and what happened to prices. And then if you want, you can wax philosophically about which ones of those are good and which ones of those are bad.
Yeah, but like employment is lagging.
True, it
So
lags.
you can't really say right away what happened.
Yeah, but you know that eventually it's going to get there, right? Because it lags behind 2, 3 months, maybe 6.
Yeah.
But it'll get there.
I mean, a lot of people lost their jobs, but when the government bailed out all those banks, employment didn't go up right away.
Of course not, yeah. But it didn't take too long ago.
No.
How long did it take?
Yeah, I'm still
Realize
worried.
it took him 6 to 9 months to get the bailouts and all of the expending passed by Congress, right?
Well, it must have lasted until at least the last quarter because
Yes.
they didn't cut the federal extended unemployment
Until after that,
benefits
yeah.
until after that.
Right, yeah. The stimulus didn't come around until the end of 2009. It literally took them a year to make it happen because there was too much bitching going on in Congress.
Right, 4 years later, finally, we're reaching.
Okay, but the fact remains, you see government increases spending. Now we're just going to
Right.
look 3 to 4 months ahead after the government does this spending. So first off, you're going to tell me, what does increased government spending do to aggregate demand and aggregate supply?
It moves the demand curve to the right.
Alright, so G is a non-price determinant of AD, so AD grows, and which way does it shift when it grows?
To the right.
To the right. So, now the question is, how far does it grow? And this one is purely up to you as to whether you move it a long ways or just a little bit of ways. I am going to move it what it really did move, in my opinion. Here is my new aggregate demand curve. Now, CPI used to be 101, GDP used to be $14 trillion, this is 2008. In 2009, in 2010, what happened to GDP? Well, here is our new equilibrium. GDP went up to 15 trillion. So remember, you got to give me 3 things. What happened to GDP, what's happening to employment, and what's going to happen to prices, right? Again, all in a 3 to 4 month span. So GDP will start to rise. And after GDP has risen for a while, what follows it?
Employment.
Employment rises a bit later. But it's going to rise. And now, what happened to prices though?
According to that, it stayed the same.
According to this, prices stay basically the same. If you think about it, a $1 trillion growth in GDP, that's like an 8 or a 9% growth in GDP. Our growth in inflation, 0.5% maybe. So clearly, one was growing way more than the other, and hence we've stayed somewhere in this relatively Keynesian stage. Now, some economists, back when that stimulus was first created, that 1.3 to $7 trillion, depending on who you talk to, wanted to say that that was enough to push aggregate demand into the intermediate stage. If aggregate demand shifted all the way to the intermediate stage, what would have happened?
Prices would have increased.
Prices would have increased a little bit, right? And there was some inflation out there in the economy, so a lot of economists were saying, see, there's the start of the inflation that we were expecting. This was enough money to stimulate the economy back into a recovery. But normally, once you hit a recovery, what starts happening?
Goes slowly.
But it should start to build up steam, right? Because once you poured enough money into people's pockets, what are people doing?
Start spending it.
They start spending. They go into the product market and spend it. Where does that money go? Back to the businesses. What do the businesses supposedly do with all that money?
Hire to the workers.
They give it back to the factor market and hire more people. If they hire more people, what do people do?
Spend more.
They take it home, spend it more. And so the whole point is that we're trying to change the way the circular flow is going. Back in 2008, 2009, the circular flow was going down the toilet, right? People were spending less, businesses were having less, they were firing more people People had less money, they spent less, business had less, they fired more people. We went through a good 3-quarter cycle of that, right? In theory, we pushed enough money into the system, or enough purchasing in the system, so that people all of a sudden started buying again, and this money got to the businesses, and the businesses said, great, let's start hiring lots of people. Unfortunately, when businesses start to see a rebound, do they hire people first? No. What do they do first? They're not that bad. Right? I mean, they still need to have somebody making product. The problem is that how do they get additional product made?
They increase overtime.
They increase overtime. That's absolutely right. They go out to their workforce and say, okay, we laid off 20% of you. That means there's 80% of you left. Work harder. We need you to work 10% more.
We need to get back up to 100%, so guess what, guys?
You guys are going to make up for it.
20% more.
Yeah, just work. They'll start with 10% more, right? And that's literally what's starting to happen, right? As aggregate demand keeps growing, this is what we've been doing over the last 4 years, is we've seen this steady movement of aggregate demand to the right, to the right, to the right. But it's my contention, and this is just my opinion on the economy, not necessarily correct, that we haven't hit the intermediate range for 2 reasons. 1, prices haven't started going up, and 2, hiring hasn't really started. Because essentially what has to happen is that all the people out there that are being forced to work overtime, what do they do eventually?
The first thing that has to happen is they got to get these companies that have left the country to come back. Yeah. Then they can have a bunch of hiring.
That's not going to happen when there's cheaper labor.
Yeah, they should.
That's never going to happen until labor costs have.
Well, instead of giving them all these shelters, they need to just shut the door there.
This is true. I'll agree that there are some incentives for businesses not to work in the United States, but regardless, though, in theory, again, this is just the basic theory. There's lots of more reality behind this. This is just the top level of the basics. Is that aggregate demand is growing, and to say that we have hit recovery, we really need to see an inflation increase. And in fact, that's what the Fed has been reporting, right? Prior to Ben Bernanke retiring, his goal was, when the economy has recovered, will be when inflation hits 2%, right? He didn't even talk about the unemployment rate, right? Because he probably looked at the way unemployment was calculated and said, egads. That's ridiculous. But inflation, that's a pretty good sign, okay? Once we get into here, we've seen recovery. You are spending enough money, Ken, to recover the entire economy. As is me. As am I. Right?
If you say so.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's a contention, okay? But the fact remains is that you are correct whichever way you move it. If you move this up into the intermediate stage and said that there was growth in GDP and employment and there was some inflation, I would give you full credit as long as your picture matches your words, okay? So when you shift aggregate demand, please make sure that where you shift it to, the words agree with what you said. Okay? If you moved aggregate demand to here, you would need to say
employment
prices went up.
Prices went up a little bit. Yeah. Employment's still going up because GDP goes up. And in theory, again, whenever GDP goes up, employment goes up eventually with it.
I thought we just said that if it's in the Keynesian range, employment is not going up.
No, prices are not going up.
Only prices.
Only prices.
So if the aggregate demand line moves to the right, employment has risen.
Employment will rise, or it is rising, one of the two. It's getting close to rising.
Then we wouldn't be in a recession anymore.
Well, not necessarily,
That's
right?
what I was getting at. I was thinking, we must be in the intermediate.
Exactly, and that's exactly what some economists say, is that we have gotten past this range to the other stage.
Well, maybe that's why the book draws it like this.
Yes.
Rather than a straight line.
Yes.
It's pretty abrupt.
Yeah, I like mine to be points. The curve that the book draws is much more fluid, and that's too deep for me. Okay? I want this to be a little bit more black and white, so that you can say one thing or the other, right? This was enough money to get us out of a recession, or it wasn't enough. And for me, getting out of the recession means that you've gotten to this stage. A recession to me doesn't necessarily mean that GDP is falling. It just means that people aren't getting paid more. In order for people to get paid more, prices have to be going up. If you've looked at wages over the last 4 years, they've kept up with inflation, and that's about it. To me, the end of a recession comes when people start getting real raises again, and I haven't seen that yet. Again, though, we are so as to whether or not this is a recession anymore, or whether or not it is a outside of a recession, it kind of depends again on how far you move the curve.
Sure.
All right. All right. So let's try another one. Let's see. Let's do Reagan. The economy is running. There's two N's in running. Put them in there. Running at close to full employment. So I've set the stage for you. How are you going to draw your initial equilibrium of the economy? It's in the classical range. Alright, so here's your aggregate supply. Here's our aggregate demand. Now, I put it very close to the edge just because at that stage in our economy we were kind of close to the full employment stage. We weren't deep into it in any way, shape, or form. But that's because I know a little bit of the history there. If you put it higher up, it's okay. Alright. So here's the setup. So in theory, GDP is hovering at $10 trillion and CPI is sitting at, say, 120. And if you think late 80s, GDP was humming along in the late 80s, and so was inflation. All right? Now, what happened in Reagan era? Computers are invented and accepted in all businesses. So one of the impressive moves that Ronald Reagan made as a president was that he is one of the guys who said, look, if your business upgrades to computers instead of paper, we will give you a tax break for every dollar that you spend on a computer. That still exists today, folks, right? Any technological advancement that your business is creating, all the money you spent on creating that technological advance gives you a tax break at the business level. That still exists today because it was such a great program back in the 80s. And the cool thing about it is what it made happen. All right? Now, what happens to aggregate demand and aggregate supply when this occurs?
Aggregate supply goes and shifts up.
Exactly. So due to new technology, and you could add in here new technology that all businesses have accepted, aggregate supply grows. And which way does it shift when it grows?
Right.
To the right. Okay. Now, this is going to look a little weird, so bear with me. We have to move the entire aggregate supply curve to the right, which is a little weird, but bear with me. So what happens to this line? It's going to move it to the right. Does it really change the line at all? No. Not really, but it does, right? Yeah, put a few extra millimeters here at the end, right? Because it shifted to the right. Now, this line also has to shift to the right. So shift it to the right. And this entire vertical line also has to shift to the right. Here's our new aggregate supply curve where we shifted to. Where's our new equilibrium?
Intermediate.
Yeah, we've kind of moved into what we would call the intermediate stage. So some people would say that we left full employment. May not sound like it's necessarily a good thing, but the fact remains what happened to GDP?
Went up.
Right? GDP shifted to the right. We went up to $11 trillion.
CPI went down.
So GDP rises. So essentially the economy kept humming. What happened to employment?
It also rose.
Employment, and not unemployment, but employment. Employment rose. Again, though, you may say we were already at full employment. How could we get past full employment? It seems a little odd, but realize again that the economy was growing at that stage, and every year, what happens to the workforce?
It's bigger.
Right? Usually more people enter the workforce every year than leave it. Usually. All right? So employment rose, or at least stayed near full. You could argue a little bit that employment really wasn't rising and that we were just staying at full employment. That would be cool. Explaining that, I'd be like, oh, good answer. I'd maybe even give you extra credit for that kind of an answer. And then last but not least, what happened to prices?
They rose.
Yeah. Prices went down.
So inflation went down?
Yeah, Why did inflation go down?
It deflated?
There was deflation. Well, there wasn't deflation. There was disinflation.
It's just,
Inflation fell, but it wasn't. It didn't. Prices didn't fall. They just stopped rising as much. So inflation used to be up here at 10, 12%. At the end of Reagan's presidency, inflation was back down to 6, 7%. That's what disinflation means, technically. Why is that? Why did that happen in the 80s? Why did computers make prices fall?
Businesses didn't need to charge as much to have the same profit margin.
Yeah, exactly. There was an automation of products, of processes. Right? It used to be that accounting firms, in order to have all of the books kept carefully and neatly, guess how many accountants they had to hire? Hundreds.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It doesn't. Technologies usually mean a loss of employment because, like, that happened.
There are a lot of economists.
They didn't need to use paper as much, so a lot of lumberjacks lost.
But what do you
their
need
jobs.
when you stop using
Paper
paper?
mills closed.
What do you need when you stop using paper? You need more computer technicians. You need more printer technicians. You need more network technicians. You need more electronic technicians. You need more infrastructure
Maybe to
builders
make those
yes.
products.
No,
to
service
meet the
them.
demand.
Service them. Service
break
them. You
down.
think a computer doesn't break down? I mean, yes, there is some structural unemployment where people who used to cut down trees and make paper now don't have a job. They have to go get a degree in computer technician or computer security and switch jobs, right? But does that mean that there's less jobs? Not necessarily, right? I mean, it could be a little bit, but
Nobody knew how to use that technology, so they messed it up all the time.
oh yeah, it messed it up for a long time in the 80s. But what ended up happening in the 90s though? Oh, the dot-com explosion, right? Jobs were everywhere. All you had to do is to say, I have any kind of a computer degree, and you got hired like that. Now, maybe you guys aren't old enough to have gone through that, but I did.
I did. Of course, I was still a neon too.
Anyways, this is the first stage of dealing with the economic analysis that I want you to do. Right? It's really which way does aggregate demand or aggregate supply move, and then based on comparing the equilibrium points, tell me what happened to GDP and prices, and then remember, according to me at least, employment and GDP go the same way. So, Chapter 14, homework. So if you got something to do over the weekend, I wouldn't want you to be bored.
Oh, heaven forbid.
You do know it's March Madness.
But there's only 2 games.
Yeah, but it's all that celebration and preparation.
Yeah, no, it's all
tailgating,
Saturday. That gives you all day Sunday, right?
Church. Church.
2, 4, 8, and 10. Somebody make sure that the pages are right, 309 through 10. Jen, is that the right page?
309.
Please note that don't go to the appendix. There's an appendix on this chapter, so we'll get there. Or we have already gotten there to some degree. I'll get them eventually. Turn in more homework and I will upgrade it. I've only put one number in for you.
I don't know what to do.